Hermann Goering was bowled over by the first speech he saw when he first met Adolf Hitler. Albert Goering was very clear when he said to his brother Hermann, "If you carry on following that Hitler bastard, it's going to end very badly for you."
My father really did not like the fact that Hermann Goering was connected with Hitler.
Albert Goering never gave the Nazi salute.
My father liked to help others, and he knew a lot of people who needed his help.
Albert helped victims of Nazism, Jews and Czechs in different ways.
My father used to steal my uncle's headed paper. He even used to forge Hermann Goering's signature.
This alerted the Gestapo, who were asking themselves more and more questions.
There was issue from the Reich security headquarters that he was to be shot on sight.
Heinrich Goering, the father of the great Goering clan, was born in 1838. He became a lawyer and a German civil servant, governor of German Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, between 1885 and 1890. After a first marriage and 5 children, he married Franziska Tiefenbrunn. This union produced another 5 children: Karl, Olga, Paula, Hermann, and Albert. One of the descendants of that family is Elisabeth Goering, Franziska's granddaughter.
Franziska, like all educated women from good families, was training to become a nurse. She became a nurse in Africa, and that's where she met the renowned European doctor, Hermann von Eppenstein.
He came to the aid of Fanny Goering, the mother, during childbirth. And from then on, they had a close connection as family friends.
Franziska's first 3 children were born abroad during Heinrich's assignments. Hermann Goering was born in Bavaria in 1893, and his junior, Albert, was born in 1895 in the suburbs of Berlin. But the Goerings harbored a big secret concerning the birth of Albert. Elisabeth Goering is Albert's daughter, but should never have borne the Goering name. The man at the center of this family intrigue was none other than Dr. von Eppenstein, Hermann Goering's godfather.
Hermann was so called because of Hermann von Eppenstein. My father, Albert Goering, who looked nothing like Hermann or his sisters, was in fact the illegitimate son of Mr. von Eppenstein and my grandmother Franziska.
Dr. Hermann von Eppenstein had inherited a great personal fortune. He was descended from German nobility. The Baron was also of Jewish extraction. In an anti-Semitic Germany, he converted to Protestantism. The godfather of Hermann and the father of Albert Goering, Hermann von Eppenstein also became the family's protector and a substitute father figure.
Eppenstein became a benefactor, a protector of the family. He provided them a castle in Feldenstein, Burg Feldenstein, in northern Bavaria, where they lived during the winter months, and Burg Martendorf, which is in Austria, during the summer months, and they spent vacations there.
The Goering brothers grew up and enjoyed a life of luxury, but von Eppenstein's influence went beyond material things.
Hermann von Eppenstein paid for Hermann Goering's studies and was the person who pushed him towards the army. He did the same for my father. My father was an engineer, and he paid for his studies too.
When the First World War broke out in July 1914, Hermann and Albert Goering were still students. For Hermann, whose childhood games were full of chivalry, war was a revelation. As an infantry cadet, he immediately got involved. He was wounded in one of the very first battles. As he convalesced, he met a fighter pilot and joined one of the very first squadrons of the German Air Force.
He wanted to be a knight, and instead of a steed, a horse, he would have an aircraft.
He was considered the very best, because at just 25 years old he was the heir to the Red Baron von Richthofen. Therefore he was squadron leader in 1918. Not bad for a 25-year-old, and he was famous too. There used to be cards with photos of pilots that were everywhere in Imperial Germany, and the most sought-after card after the Red Barons was Goering's. Albert, who was studying engineering, joined up a little later. He was assigned to a Bavarian infantry regiment. Albert was in the army. He was in the Signals Corps. He was in the trenches. He really experienced the horrors of war. He would help to win a few meters, only to lose them again a few days or a few hours later, having sacrificed thousands of men's lives. He really experienced the war in all of its gory reality. He was wounded 3 times and ended the First World War in a hospital bed. The two brothers had radically different experiences of war. This was the first cause of a split between Hermann, the Iron Cross decorated pilot, and Albert, the simple soldier. You get this vision of Hermann having an almost enthusiastic experience of war, while you feel Albert's experience was traumatic, and that he was relieved when the armistice came. Albert would in fact become a committed and passionate pacifist. Demobbed and relieved after the German defeat, Albert returned to his studies. He joined the Technical University of Munich, where he specialized in mechanical engineering. Munich was in the early throes of great political turmoil. Very soon, Albert's elder brother Hermann joined the extremist factions of ex-soldiers who felt let down by the behavior of the High Command and German politicians. They attempted an early putsch. This failed. Hermann had to leave Germany in a hurry, and he hid out in Sweden. He went to Sweden, he went to Denmark. He was a stunt pilot, he was a civil aviation trainer, he transported mail and even passengers. This was risky because he occasionally piloted a seaplane, flying from Denmark to Sweden and Sweden to Germany. At the same time, however, he couldn't resist dive bombing with passengers on board, which created a certain amount of panic, and he ended up being dismissed. In Sweden, Hermann Göring became friendly with a man called Ludwig Mannerfeld. One evening in 1920, Hermann was invited along with his friend Ludwig to a fashionable soiree at Rockelstad Castle, a few kilometers north of Stockholm. It was during the course of this soiree that he met Karin Flock. When he returned to Germany with Karin in 1922, the whole family gathered together in Bavaria. The two brothers were still close, and along with their sisters, mourned the death of their mother, Franziska. Throughout this period, there were very strong bonds. There was Hermann Göring's first wedding to Karin, where Albert Göring was one of the guests and was at the ceremony. There was also the very sad event of their mother's death, where they were forced together when they had to organize the funeral. Hermann soon began to feel lost. Germany was in the grip of an economic crisis, coupled with a great deal of political unrest. When he returned to Germany in 1922, he was all at sea. He was studying economics and political science at the University of Munich, but he wasn't terribly interested in theory. He was a man of action. It was in this context that Hermann Göring had a pivotal encounter. One evening in 1922, he was transfixed in the midst of a small crowd as he listened to a speech by an increasingly popular young corporal in a Munich Bierkeller. It was none other than Adolf Hitler. The two men had an immediate connection. It was a revelation for him to find that there were people who thought the way he did, notably about the idea that the Treaty of Versailles was a disgrace, that Germany should never have lost the war, that defeat was due to a treasonous top brass. These were Hermann Göring's feelings, and for the first time he was hearing them vehemently and passionately expressed by somebody else. This engagement with Nazism was very strongly linked to the idea of revenge and national pride. He had no connection with anti-Semitism. Unlike some of the leading members of the Nazi high command, people like Himmler and obviously Goebbels, for whom anti-Semitism was a fundamental driver in their engagement and commitment to Nazism. Albert swiftly attempted to reason with his brother. Hitler was dangerous, an opinion the rest of the family shared.
My father really did not like the fact that Hermann Göring was connected with Hitler. He used to make fun of him.
Albert was very clear, saying to Hermann, if you carry on following that bastard Hitler, those were his very words, really bad things will happen to you. It will end very badly for you. On the 8th of November 1923, Adolf Hitler, along with members of his party, including Hermann Göring, attempted to seize power in Bavaria by force. On the morning of the 9th of November, over 2,000 armed men, notably sections of the Nazi Party's assault force, paraded in front of an enthusiastic crowd. The demonstrators were met by a police cordon. There was an exchange of gunfire, and the demonstrators dispersed. It was a total failure. He himself was wounded very severely. A bullet which had ricocheted hit him in the groin, and because it was covered in mud from the road, when it penetrated the top of his thigh, the wound became infected. An injured Hitler was arrested. Göring was firstly taken to a doctor who refused to treat him. In that same building were two Jewish nurses who agreed to provide the first aid that saved his life. He quickly fled Germany for Austria, where he was cared for by the surgeons there. The only way to treat him was to give him morphine to alleviate his suffering. Unfortunately, he was someone who liked to exaggerate. He increased the dosage he took. This led to him becoming dependent on morphine, and he remained so for the rest of his life. Hermann Göring was banished from Germany and forced into exile in Sweden. When an amnesty allowed him to return to Germany in 1928, Albert Göring was no longer living in Germany, having moved to Austria for professional reasons. And this meant they had no longer a reason to meet up again.
He got a job for Junkers, and that was when he got out of Germany and he became the representative of Austria and the Balkans.
In 1926, Albert severed all links with his Nazi brother. He moved into a comfortable house on the outskirts of Vienna. He even took steps to become an Austrian citizen. Meanwhile, in Germany, his brother Hermann was climbing the rungs of power. After the Nazi Party's victory in the 1932 election, Göring became the president of the German parliament, the Reichstag.
Die Freiheit der Nation, die Ehre des Volkes und die Sicherheit des Vaterlandes die obersten Leitsterne meines Handelns sein.
It was he who raised Hitler to power.
Hitler au pouvoir.
People think that Hitler was elected chancellor, but that isn't the case. He was not elected chancellor. President Hindenburg did not want to name him as chancellor, saying, I could potentially make him minister for posts. That way he can lick stamps with my face on. And it was Goering who convinced Hindenburg to appoint Hitler. That was how Hitler came to power. Without Goering, it probably wouldn't have happened.
Il serait probablement pas arrivé.
In February 1933, he was Interior Minister for Prussia. He opened the floodgates of violence by unleashing his assault troops against opponents. He helped to create the first concentration camps and founded the feared Gestapo. Hitler rewarded him with the post of Minister for Aviation.
Ein Treiber! Sieg! Heil! Sieg! Heil! Sieg! Heil!
Meanwhile, his brother Albert had finally found his dream job, something closer to his aspirations. He had a new professional opportunity, which was a position in a major, at that time, film production company, Toby Sacha. He worked for them not as a filmmaker or a director, but as an engineer. His role was logistical, administrative, supportive. Working in the film industry allowed him to frequent the intellectual circles of Vienna, which at that time also tended to be Jewish circles. This was something that would later become very significant. It would be true to say that Albert Goering really fell in love with Vienna. He had a great admiration for the city, not only for its beauty, but also because it was one of Europe's most important centers of culture at the time. There was an intense artistic heartbeat there. Albert was rubbing shoulders with great writers and directors. During his time at Toby Sacha, he met the famous director Ernst Neubach, with whom he would become friends.
Albert Goering kennengelernt, wie den Film Millionäre gemacht hat.
He met Albert Goering when he was making the film The Millionaire. He was at the Toby Sacha studios in Vienna. At the time, Albert Goering was running the studios. The whole film industry knew about it. Everybody knew who Albert Goering was, and they were surprised to see him working in the film industry and not alongside his brother.
His name preceded him. They didn't know they obviously thought very defensive, but then once, and I think he liked doing this because he knew what they prejudged him and thought that he'd be. And I guess classic examples of Ernst Neubach, they would be very defensive. They go, I don't want to deal with you. I'm sorry. You're the brother of Hermann Goering. I don't want to put myself in thing. But he would just break the ice with a joke. For example, he said that I spit on Hitler. I spit on the whole Nazi regime. He said that, and it was like, oh, okay. And when people realize that, they think, okay. They're still very wary, but slowly, he would show his true. He'd win them over.
Although he was married, Albert was a Casanova. He had many affairs in Vienna. Albert's private life was turbulent and complicated. He was married 4 times and divorced 3 times. There was something of the dandy about him, something seductive that women often liked. He didn't shy away from it and had few scruples about it. When one dalliance was over, he would move on to the next one. Karin, Hermann's first wife, died in 1931. In late 1934, Hermann met Emmy, a theater actress in Berlin. The ensuing celebration was worthy of the biggest celebrity weddings. Adolf Hitler was the best man. The delighted congregation included the whole Goering family. Hermann and his brother had not seen each other for 12 years. Some months later, Emmy asked her husband for a favor. A friend of hers, Henny Porten, was having problems with Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's feared propaganda minister.
Henny Porten, c'est une actrice.
Henny Porten was a German actress, a real star of the 1920s German cinema. She'd made films with Lubitsch. Her crime, so to speak, was to be married to a Jewish man. Goebbels, who had full control over German culture, told her to get a divorce. Otherwise, she would be banned from working again.
Sinon, eh bien, elle sera définitivement interdite d'exercer son métier.
Entonces vino a pedirle a Emmy.
Henny Porten came to see Emmy to ask for my Uncle Herman's help to get them out of Germany. He replied that he was unable to do so. Helping Jews would end badly for him. So he contacted my father, who helped them to flee the country.
Albert managed to get her a film contract, which was, you know, out of the realms of the propaganda ministry in Nazi Germany, and that gave her a livelihood and protection.
Why would one of the most dangerous and unscrupulous men in Hitler's regime help a Jew? Is there an answer to this mystery?
C'est assez étonnant.
It really is quite surprising. But in fact, this is key to understanding Hermann Göring's personality. We have evidence from two psychiatric studies 15 years apart, and both experts reached the same conclusion, which is troubling. They concluded that Hermann was very sentimental about his loved ones, but completely callous where everyone else was concerned. This is surely the key to his personality, because it means that he was very sentimental about his family, very protective, and then there was that other side of him, the man without scruples. When it came to eliminating the enemy within, which initially was the communists, he did it tenaciously and efficiently. During the war, he was equally unscrupulous. If winning the war meant destroying entire towns and massacring the civilian population, he was more than happy to do so. This rescue mission was a revelation for Albert Göring. This was the first time that he realized he could help people. This was a chaotic time, where the very existence of certain people was under threat because of Nazism, and that he could possibly do something to help.
Initially, it came from the help he provided to that woman's husband. But then, of course, this gave my father an idea. My father liked to help others, and he knew a lot of people who needed help, so he carried on.
Albert's period of respite in Vienna, far from the Nazis' fury, was not to last long. On the 12th of March 1938, the German army invaded Austria, followed by Adolf Hitler. The Führer made a triumphal entry into the capital, alongside Reich Marshal Göring. Hermann Göring used the opportunity to visit his brother.
They meet up and they have a meeting in Grenzing in Albert's villa. Hermann was in such a great mood, according to Olga, that he said, "I'll grant you a wish, anything you want." And Albert basically ambushed this, rained on literally Hermann's parade, and said that, well, there's Archduke Joseph Ferdinand of Austria, and we have found out that he was being harassed and then taken to Dachau concentration camp. If you wanted to give us a wish, we wish you to do something about that and free him.
When the Anschluss was declared the day after Hitler's arrival on the 13th of March 1938, Archduke Joseph Ferdinand was arrested. He was sent to Dachau, where the conditions of his incarceration were very harsh. He was released thanks to Hermann Göring's intervention. The Archduke subsequently led a lonely life in Vienna under the constant supervision of the Gestapo until his death in 1942. Immediately, Albert Göring saw the danger, a double danger, in fact. Firstly, there was the Nazis' transformation of Vienna. He saw that this bastion of freedom was going to collapse suddenly. And he was also conscious of the danger for many of his friends, notably the Jewish ones, and the people he worked with, whom he'd spent so much time with over the 4 or 5 years he'd worked for the film company. At the time, there were 190,000 Jews in Austria, and the persecution, particularly in Vienna, was even worse than in Germany. Public humiliations, expropriations, forced emigration. The arrival of the German troops unleashed a tide of violence. Jewish homes and businesses were pillaged, and the streets became the theater for violence and harassment.
And in this particular time, Albert came across the scene, and there was this elderly lady in front of this paint shop, and she was forced to wear the sign saying, "I am a Sal Jew, I am a Jewish pig," basically.
They'd thrown her onto the pavement, and a police officer had brought her a mop and bucket and ordered her to wash the floor in the street. People around her were mocking her, calling her a Jew and insulting her. My father walked by and asked what was going on. A man replied, "She's here to clean the street. Let her do her job." So my father took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and knelt down. He said to the man, "You have no business here, why don't you go home?" Then he took the bucket from the woman and started to clean the street himself. The local Gestapo officer turned up and asked, "What business is this of yours? Who are you?" My father answered, "I am Goering."
And he was arrested, and that was the first time he was arrested. And he was taken to the local constabulary, and his name and connections got him out. His brother didn't have to help him in that time.
As Albert had foreseen, the German and Austrian Nazis enacted anti-Jewish legislation at double speed. Every profession was affected, notably the Toby Sasha studios where Albert Goering worked. One of its directors, Oskar Pilzer, became a target for the Gestapo.
The Gestapo came in to his apartment, ripped it apart, ransacked, ripped out the father, George Pilzer, the son, witnessed this and taken to a jail in Vienna. And word got to Albert. Albert found out where he was, got him out, then personally escorted him to the Italian border, allowed him to free, arranged transport visas for the family, and in the end they could meet up in Paris.
On the list of Jews who were to be arrested was the name of one of Albert's friends, the screenwriter and director Ernst Neubach, who managed discreetly to flee Vienna.
My father had to run away. In 1938, he fled Vienna during Kristallnacht, and he found refuge in Paris.
It's quite plausible that Albert helped him to procure documents, at least a visa, which allowed him to escape and flee to France.
So the next day, sure enough, the Gestapo or police ransacked his apartment with his wife there, and his wife was an Aryan. But totally ransacked. Albert came over and consoled her and helped them to reunite in the end.
But this respite for Ernst Neubach and his family was not to last long. In a bid to escape the Nazis who were starting to hunt down Austrian and German Jewish refugees in France, he changed his identity. He joined the army and became French citizen Ernest Neuville.
Dann kamen die Nazis.
Then the Nazis came, they invaded France. My father only had two options open to him. He could either join the Foreign Legion or go to a detention camp. He and some of his friends opted for the Foreign Legion, and he stayed with them until the end of the war.
Even politicians were not immune to arrest, as the Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg discovered. In order to help the man and his family, whom Hitler wanted to get rid of, Albert once more called on his brother.
He was actually taken to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where he could live in much better conditions than other concentration camp inmates, and he could live with his wife in a little house on the side of Sachsenhausen concentration camp.
Albert's requests were very audacious. However, he knew that Hermann Goering could bring all his glory and power to bear to help his brother. When Albert called upon Herman to resolve the situation, Herman did what he did not out of empathy for those who may ultimately be saved, but just to make his younger brother happy. And he made it clear to everybody that if anyone touched a hair on the Reichsmarschall's family or the Reichsmarschall's protégés, there would be hell to pay. Albert knew he had protection, but still took considerable risks. His motivations were personal. His brother Herman was a last resort when there were problems. Albert decided to leave his beloved Vienna very soon after the Anschluss. He very quickly realized that he would no longer be able to work for the film company, as this was clearly going to be taken over by Goebbels' Nazis, and any filmmaking would be subject to his diktats. He would no longer be able to produce any artistic project that would interest Albert Goering, and in 1939 he found a new opportunity, which was to work for the Skoda company, which meant he had to move to Prague.
Bruno Seletsky was an export director for Skoda, which was a Czechoslovakian. They did a lot of things, trains, hardware, munitions, a huge empire concern, which just happened to be also taken over by Hermann Göring Werke, which is Albert's brother's big empire, and Bruno Seletsky thought that they couldn't do anything about that.
And he thought someone who's trusted could be useful to us. This was not without a degree of ulterior motive, as he thought it could also be helpful to the Czech resistance at the time.
Albert did. He agreed. In June, he goes to Prague, signs a contract, and he becomes the new export director for Skoda.
Albert accepted the offer from Skoda. In Prague, already under the Nazi yoke in 1938, a new life began for him. Albert met new people and forged new links. One of these was with Dr. Joseph Harvat. My grandfather met Albert Goering one day when he came to see him as a patient. I have no idea what his health problem might have been, but my father examined him, and from that moment on, a friendship gradually grew between them. Terror soon descended upon Czechoslovakia and Prague. The Nazis set their sights on the country's intelligentsia. All the Czechs' freedoms were eroded immediately. Freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. Universities were closed, students were imprisoned, and anyone who rebelled was sent to a concentration camp. In fact, that was what happened to my grandfather, who was a member of the intelligentsia and leader of the Scouts Federation, was among the first to be arrested and sent to Buchenwald.
Albert found out this, and he did, this is, again, he was a master tactician. He was so tactful. What he did, he wrote a letter on Goering family stationery, wrote to the commandant of Buchenwald concentration camp, that I demand that you release my personal physician, Dr. Joseph Harvat, and he signed just Goering.
In fact, my father used to steal my uncle's headed paper. He even used to forge Hermann Göring's signature. Hermann had a country house in the Alps. When my father went there with my mother, he would steal headed paper from my uncle's desk, and he used this paper to make exit permits. He forged my uncle's signature so that more people could escape. That was what my father used to do, and my uncle never knew a thing about it.
In these letters written on his brother's headed paper, Albert even went as far as to threaten officers with sanctions if they didn't do as they were told.
According to Harvat, he said all of a sudden he found himself released from Buchenwald concentration camp, and he was on a train station, catching a train back to Prague, emaciated of course, next to another guy. And he didn't know this guy. He goes, what's your name? He said, my name's Joseph. What's your last name? Harvat. Dr. Joseph Harvat. So there were two Dr. Joseph Harvats at the same time, but because the commandant didn't know which Dr. Joseph Harvat he meant, he released both of them.
One fine day, my grandfather reappeared at home, to the great amazement of my grandmother, my mother, and the rest of the family.
Nevíry v to, že to je opravdu pravda mé babičky a
It was like a miracle.
a všech příbuzných.
They were astonished.
Byli opravdu tím velmi překvapení a bylo.
And they were all the happier because the surprise was so unexpected.
Tím víc, oč bylo nečekané. Že bylo nečekané v té době. No.
The war was now a global conflict. At Škoda's head office, the Nazis were putting increasing pressure on those who worked for the strategically important business alongside Albert. Karel Sobota became Albert's assistant at Škoda.
The resistance was everywhere. From the board, even the president of the board was a resistant, and he acted together with Albert Goering in order to obtain funding to finance the Czech resistance, and also to pass documents to the United States containing important technology developments.
One of the most important figures in the business was a man called Jan Moravec. He was one of the company directors and one of the first members of the resistance. He soon fell under the Nazis' suspicion. In order to keep him and his family from danger, Albert Goering got him a post at Škoda's branch in Bucharest in Romania, enabling him to escape the clutches of the Gestapo.
By helping Moravec and also giving him space, he could continue working in the resistance. And he could continue sending messages back to London and fighting this proxy war for the resistance, Czech resistance.
Within the company, as well as the management, the workers were sabotaging war material destined for the German army. There were acts of sabotage, deadlines which weren't met, a way was often found to put a spanner in the works. There were all sorts of things happening, and it was a known fact that Albert Goering was aware of them and was covering them up, tacitly supporting them. He was trying at best to turn a blind eye, to not inform on anyone. Albert Goering rapidly earned the respect of Škoda's Czech workforce.
Albert Goering never gave the Nazi salute. He never raised his hand in the Nazi salute. He never replied to the Heil Hitler salute. And this happened in closed doors. So Albert was not kind of wanting to do some publicity about it or to show other people he was a good person.
At the same time, in Austria, in Hermann and Albert's childhood village of Mautendorf, one of their friends had fallen victim to the zeal of the Austrian Nazis. Michael Hohenzin, a peaceful inhabitant of the village, was harassed by the local Gestapo. Before the war, my father was a typical Austrian, with no sympathy for the German regime. For a short time, he was head of Hautendorf's Heimwehr, a social Christian organization. The Nazis grasped the opportunity to ask him to join the Nazi Party, because they knew he would not do it. He refused, and they used this refusal as a pretext to denounce him as an enemy of Hitler. He was immediately arrested. He spent some time in prison in Salzburg before being sent to Dachau. At this stage of the war in 1941, Dachau, which lies north of Munich, was an extermination camp where people were murdered relentlessly. But my mother was a very good friend of Dr. Riegele's wife, Hermann Goering's sister, who spent a lot of time here.
Und die hat sofort alles in Bewegung gesetzt und sich
She immediately got to work, contacting her brother and insisting that he intervene to secure Mr. Hohensinn's release.
Herr Hohensin wieder freigelassen wird. Und weil der Hermann Göring wahrscheinlich nicht.
And as it seemed she was unable to reach Hermann, she turned to Albert, who was in Czechoslovakia and had a good job in Skoda's factories.
In den Skoda-Werken. Und ja, und dann ist
And Hohensin was able to leave Dachau.
Von Dachau nach Hause gekommen.
Albert went further still. One of his friends in Prague was the Swiss ambassador, Mr. Groib. The two men elaborated a system to finance escape routes.
Albert and Groib had collaborated together on the idea of setting up a bank account in Switzerland where they could funnel money to this bank account, which could be used to help refugees fleeing Nazi Germany.
It was during a soiree organized by the Swiss embassy that he met Mila. It was October 1942, and it was love at first sight. They got married and spent their honeymoon in the family chateau at Martondorf in Austria. A few weeks later, Albert received a plea for help. It was from Franz Lehár, a Viennese composer and orchestra conductor, famous throughout Europe. One of his compositions, The Merry Widow, was a favorite of Hitler's. Lehár's wife, Sophie Paschkis, was Jewish, and the Nazis threatened to send her to a concentration camp. Albert hurried to Berlin and demanded to see his brother. The two men met in Hermann's office at his ministry.
It tells the story, what's happening to Franz Lehár, basically what I said, how can this happen to Hitler's favorite operetta, imagine if he finds out. And that's how Albert worked. He knew that he couldn't just say, can you help me? He couldn't, and someone would help you. He would have to give a great argument. He would either use Hermann's ego and pride and say, Hermann, you were such a great, powerful man. How can you allow this to happen under your watch?
As a result, Hermann Göring sent his brother to plead the Lehár family's case to Joseph Goebbels. The meeting went well and a solution was found.
Il va obtenir un certificat.
He obtained a certificate of Aryanity, so to speak, a certificate that proved that this woman was in fact Aryan and not Jewish.
Gave her special privileged status, so as long as she was married to Franz Lehár, she would be protected.
As a way of thanking Albert, Franz Lehár composed a piece of music for him and invited him and Mila to Budapest in Hungary to hear it. Mila and Albert sat in the front row, just behind Franz Lehár's podium. These are the only existing filmed images of Albert Göring. Despite Albert Göring's attempts to act with the utmost discretion, some of his acts and deeds were known to others. They were known by the British Secret Service. There was a report on Albert Göring by the intelligence service that showed that he had links, notably with the Hungarian resistance. Obviously, this alerted the Gestapo, which was becoming increasingly suspicious. A certain number of reports were published regarding Albert Göring, the last of which was rather worrying. He was accused of being a public enemy. Therefore, things were becoming increasingly dangerous for Albert. The Gestapo issued a number of warrants for his arrest. At least 3 of these warrants have since been found. Meanwhile, Albert had settled in Bucharest, where he ran a subsidiary of the Skoda Group. He was keen to get away from the increasingly oppressive atmosphere in Prague. Added to this, Mila had just given birth to a daughter. She was called Elizabeth. His acts and deeds had not gone unnoticed, however. Albert was under strict surveillance. In the summer of 1944, the situation became very troubling. The Red Army was at the gates of Bucharest, a city which had been heavily bombed by the Americans. Europe was freeing itself of the Nazi yoke.
Albert needs to get out, but before he can organise a transport, he gets a tip-off that his passport has been frozen, and he had a special passport to travel all through the Third Reich, and two, that there was issue from the Reich security headquarters that he was to be shot on sight.
A few months later, the Soviet army was fighting in Berlin while the Americans were in Bavaria. These were Hitler's final days. Hermann and Albert Goering were at Mautendorf Castle. Towards the end of the war, Albert's health started to deteriorate, and his brother told him to go and seek treatment from the Americans. It was on Hermann's advice that he went to the Americans, hoping to be treated. He told himself that in any case, he had never been a member of the Nazi Party, he had never been involved with them, and he was running no risk. The day after the German surrender, on the 8th of May 1945, Hermann and Albert gave themselves up. The Goering brothers were in American hands. They were both imprisoned at Augsburg, a town north of Munich in Bavaria. It was the last time the two of them were to meet. Hermann said to Albert, "I'm sorry to have caused you all this trouble. It's my fault you're here. But you'll be fine, because I know that they haven't got anything on you. It's going to be a lot more complicated for me, so you have to promise me one thing. Whatever happens, take care of my wife and daughter." The American investigators at the Nuremberg trials, which were to examine the case files of Nazi criminals, were already rubbing their hands with glee. In Hermann and Albert Goering, they thought they had two of the leading protagonists of the regime. They rapidly had to reconsider Albert's case. He had not even been in Germany during the war. He knew very little about his brother's activities. The investigators were skeptical. Albert knew he had to prepare his own defense.
It was at that time he wrote a list of the people he'd helped to escape. Obviously, it only contained the names of the most prominent and important people. Mr. Lehar's wife, for example.
There were 34 names on the list. The ones Albert could remember, the most well-known ones, and mainly those for whom he could provide an address. He made sure the list found its way to the investigators. A few days later, he was once more questioned by an American officer.
When my father told him about all those people he'd helped, including a certain Sophia Lehar, he reacted, saying that the story must be true because he knew the woman. She was his aunt, and had told him about Hermann Goering's brother, helping her to flee the country.
He very quickly decided to believe what Albert Goering had said, and his report said that this man did not belong in prison and should be released. In a last twist of fate, exonerated by the Americans, he was nonetheless extradited to Czechoslovakia. In the throes of denazification, the new authorities wanted to try him for his work at Skoda during a period when the business was controlled by the Nazi war machine. His supposed complicity with the enemy was the object of reproach, and this trial was very, very risky for him.
My father wrote a long letter to Eduard Beneš, who was president of Czechoslovakia at the time, asking him to acquit Albert Goering and release him because of the large number of people he had helped.
Czech resistance, like Moravec, many Skoda employees and many families that he had helped spoke out in his favor. Acquitted and free, Albert was in very poor health. In the meantime, Hermann Goering, who'd been found guilty at Nuremberg and sentenced to hang, had committed suicide. Albert was depressed and lost.
My mother had discovered that he'd had many girlfriends. He was very prolific in that respect. He had a secretary who was very fond of my mother, and she found the situation very upsetting. One day she told my mother everything.
The family broke up in 1947 after a traumatic lawsuit, during which Albert tried to keep custody of Elizabeth. He lost the case, and a double separation ensued. Mila decided to leave Europe for good and moved to Lima in Peru. where Elizabeth still lives to this day.
My mother always made me write to him. She had this admirable trait of never speaking ill of her ex-husband. Despite what he had put her through, she always did everything she could to maintain a relationship between us, but my father never replied to my letters.
Albert had become a pariah, living from odd jobs around Bavaria.
Things went off the rails. He tried to get a job and he couldn't get work. His name always popped up. And that's the biggest irony, is that this name that saved so many people ended up contributing to his own downfall.
Albert Goering died in 1966, having never seen his daughter again. He was laid to rest alongside his parents and siblings in Munich's main cemetery. However, the family vault's memorial stone has been taken down, as descendants of the Goering family did not have the means to finance the lease on the plot. In 2013, historian William Burke submitted a dossier to Yad Vashem in Israel, asking them to accord Albert Goering the title of Righteous Among Nations for having saved so many lives, including those of Jews. This request was denied in 2015. To be recognized as righteous among nations, you have to have saved Jewish lives, but it has to be at risk to your own life. Does this second condition apply to Albert Goering? That's the most important question. Obviously, there are the Gestapo arrest warrants. Obviously, there were tricky situations for Albert Goering, but despite all of that, he was still protected by his brother. It's well known that he was always conscious of his brother's protection, which is what makes it so difficult. This rejection is not final, so numerous and pertinent are the elements presented by William Burke's dossier. In fact, Yad Vashem has not completely closed off all options, but there is an awkward taint attached to the Goering name. From a family point of view, how did his daughter cope with the fact that he never responded to the letters and pictures she sent him? Has she forgiven him?
I know that I have to forgive him. He redeemed himself in my eyes. You see, I realize he did an awful lot for people who needed his help at a very hard time. He had values, without a doubt. That you have to respect. What can I do about the fact that he forgot me? I really got the worst of him as a person, but what does that matter? You're talking about the life of an individual against the lives of many, and I think that is more important.